So to kick off, patient-reported outcomes and patient-centered outcomes, is there a difference? As many of you know, just a bit about the National Health Council. We're a member organization in Washington, D.C., and most of our members, the majority of them, are patient advocacy organizations. And as you see here on this slide, we represent a wide, diverse group of patient advocacy organizations, and we like to say that we represent the over 160 million people in the United States who have at least one chronic disease or disability. So an outline about what we're going to talk about today. Why are we having this webinar? We wanted to talk a little bit about why we think this is important and that the timing is important right now to talk about this. To introduce the concept of clinical outcome assessment and what are we talking about when we talk about COA, and then talking specifically about patient-centered versus patient-reported outcomes, as that's the main topic and main theme for today. We're going to go over a few examples of what we mean by this. We'll have some time for Q&A, so please be sending your questions in, and Jason will be curating them as they come in to see if there are some that group together as being similar or overlapping kinds of questions, so we can cover as many of them as possible. And then we're going to do a little wrap-up at the end with our announcement of our next webinar. So why are we having this conversation? Well, as many of you already know, the FDA has begun an initiative called Patient-Focused Drug Development, and that was something that came specifically out of PDUFA 5 legislation that was implemented starting in 2012. And we've gone through the 5 years of PDUFA 5. We're wrapping that up this year, and the work that's been done between 2012 when it was signed into legislation until today. I've been told that you're having difficulty hearing me, and so I'm going to move closer to a larger microphone so that everyone can hear me a little bit better. So just to repeat a little bit of what I was talking about, we have the FDA initiative on patient-focused drug development that was actually kicked off with the PDUFA 5 legislation. And in that legislation, the FDA's Patient-Focused Drug Development Initiative was kicked off. More recently, under the 21st Century Cures legislation and the PDUFA 6 legislation, there's specific mandate to the FDA to produce guidance documents to help move patient engagement in medical product development forward. And there are 4 that are outlined here. The first is on collecting comprehensive and representative input. The draft of that guidance document came out earlier this year. There was a call for comments on that guidance, and the deadline for that was in September, and we expect to see a final version of that coming out soon. Later this year, just more recently, drafts of guidance documents 2 and 3 came out. The FDA held a meeting in October to discuss these 2 drafts on 2 and 3, and we expect, the comments for these guidance documents are due within the next month, and then we expect to see the more final versions of those coming out early next year. Later next year, we see guidance document draft 4 coming out, and again, expect that the FDA would be holding another public meeting on the draft of guidance 4 in order to get more input on that. And we would expect to see guidance document number 4 probably coming out in early 2020. So as the FDA is working its way through these guidance documents, the topic of patient-centeredness and patient-reported outcomes is, of course, in front of mind. Specifically, guidance documents 2 and 3 are geared toward looking at clinical outcome assessment, which includes patient-reported outcomes. And when guidance documents 2 and 3 are finalized, we've been told that they will replace the old guidance document that came out in 2009 that the FDA put out on patient-reported outcomes. So it's all converging in the area of patient centricity, having patients be involved in medical product development, and how do we actually measure that through clinical outcome assessments, as the FDA refers to these, which includes patient-reported outcomes. And so more recently, we've also had the FDA look toward getting input from the public on what should a standard core
clinical outcome assessment set look like, and is that something that they should be working toward, and a series of questions that they ask the public to comment on along these lines. So definitely something that's front of mind for FDA. It's definitely a very big component of patient-focused drug development and patient-focused medical product development. We see this as being something that's very important to the patient community, because patients and patient advocacy organizations are certainly going to be asked to become more engaged in these activities, and we really want to be sure that they have the knowledge and the capacity to engage when they want to become more involved and when they're called upon to do so. Other reasons why we're having this webinar, we are talking about the interest in patient-reported outcomes and patient-centeredness across the board in the healthcare ecosystem. We see much more attention for patient-centered outcomes research, as we've seen coming from PCORI, and then just in terms of patient engagement in clinical practice guideline development, in healthcare delivery, in research like patient-centered outcomes research, in payment models, and in quality measurement. So there isn't just a role for patient engagement in medical product development. There's a role in many areas, and oftentimes part of that role will be capturing patient-reported outcomes. So we want to, as I said earlier, make sure that the NHD membership is prepared to engage in these conversations when it comes to clinical outcome assessment, and therefore we've put this webinar series together to be sure that we can bring information to the membership and to others about what's going to be happening in clinical outcome assessment in the near future, the patient's role in all of that, and then we are gearing up to have in second quarter of 2019 a larger conference on this topic to bring experts together and patient groups together to really jump into what's the next step for patient engagement in this activity. So let's begin now with a definition of clinical outcome assessment. And the FDA's definition is these are assessments that are used to measure patients' symptoms, overall mental state, or the effect of a disease or condition on how the patient functions. So very often you'll hear it referred to that COAs tell you something about how a patient feels and or how a patient functions. So COAs are very often the umbrella term that's used to capture this kind of information. And it may not necessarily come directly from the patient, but it can come from the patient, and most often we like to see it come directly from the patient. So here are some of the tools, and again, this is information that comes from the FDA. The kinds of tools that get used in clinical outcome assessment include patient-reported outcome measures, so the topic for today that we really want to get to, and that's reports that come from the patient about the status of the patient's health condition without amendment or interpretation of what the patient says by a clinician or by anyone else. So it is the patient's direct report about how they feel or how they function. That's different than a clinician-reported measure, and those are often referred to as ClinROs. And these are reports that come from a trained healthcare professional, like a doctor or a nurse, and it's after observing the patient's health condition. So essentially, that clinician is reporting what they observe. They're not stating their input or their measure of how they believe the patient feels or functions. They're stating what they observe about how the patient feels or functions. Third, we have observer-reported outcome measures. Those are very often called OBSROs. This is an observation by someone other than the patient and other than the healthcare professional. It could be a parent, it could be a spouse, it could be a caregiver who is not a clinical caregiver, as in a nurse or an aide, but somebody who is in a regular position to observe and report on specific aspects of that patient's health. So as I said, this could be the parent reporting on the child. It could be a family caregiver who's taking care of an elderly person, for example, someone with Alzheimer's disease, and they can report on what they observe in that person's how they may be feeling or functioning, but it's an observation of how they think they are feeling or functioning. And lastly, we have what's called performance outcome measures, or PERFOs. This is based on a task that the patient is asked to perform according to some instructions, and the test is administered by someone who has been trained. Very often, this is a healthcare professional, but it doesn't necessarily have to be, as long as it's someone who has been trained to do this observation. And it's a person reporting their observation of how the individual patient performs the task. So, for example, there are some health conditions where an observer might watch the patient perform a 6-minute walk test. That's a performance outcome measure where the individual will observe how the patient performs that task according to the instructions and scores them based on their observation of what's done. So what's the patient's role in all of this? Well, it's very important to have patients engaged in the development of these tools. It helps for the measure to be sure that it's capturing the concepts that are important to the patient that should be measured. So based on their experience with their disease or with the treatments that they've had in the past, it tells what are the concepts that are important to those patients and what are the things that they really care about. If you're going to develop a tool on this, and the tool will have questions in it, it tells you how those questions should be worded. What are the words that patients use to describe their experience, to describe their symptoms, to describe the way they feel or the way they function? It helps to ensure that the questions are understandable to patients. It helps to understand if different patients would interpret the question in different ways or the same way, because you want to ensure that that question is understandable to the patients, to all of the patients who are going to be answering that. It helps you to understand if the recall period is appropriate. So, for example, a question may have what's termed a recall period in it, which means beginning a question with "in the last day" or "in the last week" or "since the last time I saw you." That's the recall period, how much time you want the person to think about when they're answering the question. It helps you to understand whether or not the recall period that you're including in that question, whether or not it's an appropriate recall period. Maybe it's too soon, maybe it's too long ago. You want to be sure that you get that right. It also helps to ensure that the response scale makes sense to the person who's answering the question. So the response scale may be something that would be very often, not often, seldom, never happens. So you want to be sure that if you're asking a person to pick from those choices, that they are appropriate choices, they're choices that make sense to the person, and that they actually do relate to that person's experiences with how they feel or function. And then also, what is the best data collection mode? Should you be asking them face-to-face? Should you be talking to them over the telephone? Should you ask them maybe on a form that they would fill out on paper or over the internet? So the best data collection methods, given the individual's condition, given their ability to respond, given the amount of burden that you'd like to keep the patient from having. So now to our critical question, now that we've covered a few of these background items about why we're talking about this topic and a little bit of background on what the topic really is all about, since the phrase clinical outcome assessment hasn't been used that long and may not be something that's familiar to most patients or patient groups. We're going to talk about patient-centered. So we here at the National Health Council define patient-centered as any process, program, or decision that's focused on patients in which patients play an active role as meaningfully engaged participants, and the central focus is on optimizing the use of the information that those patients provide. So in essence, it's doing things with patients, not for or to patients. So you can be doing things for or to patients, but if you're not doing it with them, it's not really patient-centered. So the idea of this is to rely on meaningful patient engagement, to interact with patients as partners and participants in the activity so that the information that you gain from them can be used to improve the activity that you're working on, improve health care, improve a treatment based on the information that they provide. So what is patient-reported? Well, as we talked about a little earlier, the FDA's definition, and a definition that's also used by the National Institutes of Health, is one that is a report that comes directly from the patient about their health condition, and it is not interpreted by anyone else. It's their direct report. It can be done by self-report or by interview. It could be about symptoms or other unobservable concepts known only to that patient. So, for example, you as an individual are the only one who can truly tell someone how much pain you might be feeling or how much nausea you may be experiencing. It's not something that someone can report for you. That person could observe that they think that you're in pain because of something that you're expressing or that you're not functioning well, but it's really an observation that the other person would be reporting. They wouldn't be reporting directly on your level of pain. And it's your perspective on your function or your ability to participate in activities that could also be observed by others. So with those two definitions, we have to consider that, that there's some overlap in what we see in these two definitions, but they're not always directly the same. So are patient-reported outcomes and patient-centered outcomes, is there a difference? Yes, there is a difference. And so will they overlap? Yes, we want them to overlap. But do they always overlap? No, they don't always overlap. So patient-centered versus patient-reported. This is a Venn diagram, and of course, the diagram that we've drawn here is simply for illustrative purposes. It's not that it would always look this way. Of course, the overlap could be much more substantial or it could be much smaller depending upon the specific issue or condition that you're focused on. But that area where they overlap is where patient-centered outcomes and patient-reported outcomes are the same. So patient-centered, the things that are important to patients in the way that they, in the view of the things that are important to them in their experience and in dealing with their disease or their treatments, and in patient-reported outcomes, it's things that can only be reported by the patient and how they feel or function. So just some background on a little bit of patient centricity when it comes to patient-reported outcome measures. The earlier PRO guidance that I mentioned a few minutes ago that's going to be replaced by the new guidance documents that will be coming out in 2019, let's go back to it, and it says that without adequate documentation of patient input, a PRO instrument's content validity is likely to be questioned. And that just simply means that if patients weren't involved, then how do we really know that that tool is capturing the things that patients care about and the things that are important to them? We want to be sure that that's always happening, that patients have had input, and we can really be confident that the concepts that are being captured by that questionnaire are the ones patients care the most about. It also said that if symptoms known to be common to the population to be studied in a clinical trial are missing from the measure that's meant to capture those important systems, then we would question that instrument's content validity. Again, having to have input from the population being studied to be sure that those symptoms and the way that they feel and function are being appropriately captured. So just using this background information where the expectation is that a patient-reported outcome measure would be patient-centered, then wouldn't that mean that all PROs should be patient-centered? Well, the answer to that is theoretically yes. That is exactly what we're going for. We want to be sure that all patient-reported outcome measures are patient-centered. They are capturing the things that patients have told us are the things most important to them. But we have a cautionary message, and that's that when you're thinking about older measures that are out there, measures that may have been developed years before the issues or the attention to patient centricity came about, they may have been developed without reliance on understanding what is most important to patients. Not true for all of them, but it may be true for some of them. Some older measures, of course, can be updated or adapted in some way to be sure that they include and emphasize those concepts that are most important to patients. And I think that's a lot of the conversation that's happening right now is how best to do that kind of work. And it certainly is something that's been expressed in some of the FDA materials that have been out, especially the request for information that the FDA had out about core measure sets. Can this adaptation happen and how can it happen. So the cautionary message here is that no one should assume that a pro tool is patient-centered until you really understand how it was developed or that it was adapted so that it can focus on what's important to patients. And so it's just having a keen eye to be sure to look for those kinds of things so that you can understand the Venn diagram, to be sure that the questions being asked and the concepts that we're looking for in some of these existing tools really do capture what patients have told us that is important. We've seen many organizations in the last few years really taking this on seriously, that they want to be sure that some of the older, what may be referred to sometimes as legacy tools or legacy questionnaires that are out there, really have a good patient-centered focus to be sure that that Venn diagram is overlapping more and more. So keep in mind, not all patient-reported outcomes are patient-centered, and not all patient-centered outcomes are patient-reported. However, pro measures can and should be both, and that's really what we're looking for. So now I want to go on to some examples. Jason, do we have any questions that we might want to tackle before we go to the examples?
None yet, but just a reminder again, if you have tried to speak up and your line was muted just due to the volume of this webinar, so please do use the chat feature if you have any questions or comments.
Thanks. So please send your questions in. We're open to a Q&A session after we go through a couple of examples. So the first example that we have here is on chronic fatigue syndrome. The FDA held a Voice of the Patient meeting in 2013, and at that meeting, patients expressed that they would like to have a biomarker for their disease. They stated that it would help convince their families, their friends, their work colleagues that they really have an illness, and it could help remove the stigma associated with their disease. So the question here is, and we ask that you select A, the biomarker that might come out of something like this is a patient-centered outcome, or the biomarker is a patient-reported outcome, or the biomarker is both patient-centered and patient-reported, or the biomarker is neither. It's not patient-centered and it's not patient-reported. So you have the ability to vote here. So we're asking for those of you that are on the line, if you'd like to vote.
Yep, you'll see the polling feature. It'll pop up on the right side where you have the participants, and you'll see all the options. So click A, B, C, or D. We'll give you about 30 seconds to select that, and then we'll keep moving. And I can see some of them are starting to come in.
Moving slowly, but it is moving. Mm-hmm. Ooh, we're seeing the numbers jump.
All right, we'll give another 15 seconds.
So let's hope that as many of you, or the percentage of you that are voting right now, is the same as the jump in voting that we saw yesterday.
All right, should we show the answer?
So let's show the answer.
So for those of you who selected A, the biomarker is a patient-centered outcome, which was the majority of folks who responded in.
Yeah. So let's talk about why this is. Okay. A biomarker is patient-centered because patients said it's very important to me. This is something that will help me deal with the stigma that I believe I have, that I experience in my life. I feel that I have this stigma associated with my disease. It's something that would help me address that stigma. Therefore, it's very patient-centered because patients asked for this, and it was something that was of high importance to them. But a biomarker is not patient-reported. Patients don't report the biomarker. And think about what a biomarker is. A biomarker could be a blood test. So the patient would go, they would have their blood drawn, the doctor's office would get a report from the lab on that biomarker. It's not a report coming directly from the patient about the way they feel or about the way they function. It's something that would come from a lab or lab value. So it is not patient-reported. That's why the answer for this one was A. So going on to number 2, hemophilia A, hemophilia B, von Willebrand disease, and other heritable bleeding disorders. A Voice of the Patient meeting was held in 2014 on this group of diseases, and patients expressed that joint pain is one of the most significant symptoms associated with their disease. So again, love to see you voting. A, joint pain is a patient-centered outcome. B, joint pain is a patient-reported outcome. C, joint pain is both patient-centered and patient-reported. Or D, joint pain is not a patient-centered outcome nor a patient-reported outcome. And we'll give you a few seconds to vote. Remember, you can only choose one.
Okay, so you'll see a new one that just popped up that you can use for example 2.
Should be on your screen now.
Yep.
Give it just a few seconds.
Sorry about that. There we go.
Great. You didn't know there was going to be a pop quiz today, did you?
Give it about another 20 seconds, a couple more. I know there's still a few more of you out there.
I see that a few more of you still have you're in progress, so we'll give you a couple more seconds to finish up. Okay, ready to go. All right, so the answer is joint pain is both a patient-centered and patient-reported outcome. So how is it patient-centered? Well, it's patient-centered because patients expressed that joint pain is one of the most significant symptoms associated with their disease. And that came from patients reporting on their experience and how they feel or function with their disease. It's also patient-reported because only a patient can report on their level of pain. Someone else can report what they observe about the patient's pain, but only a patient can report about their pain. So pain with this disorder is both patient-centered and it's patient-reported. And the large majority of you, I think all of you, actually, all of you got that one right.
All right, and so for the last one sec.
We're going to go to the last example.
And this is example 3 when you're scrolling down. You just have to scroll down a little bit in the polling question after we get to the question.
Okay. So this is non-24-hour sleep-wake disorder. Researchers developed a sleep diary to document and quantify sleep and waking behaviors for patients with this disorder. The items were selected by combining items, and when we say items, we mean questions that come from older questionnaires. So there were several older questionnaires that were used about sleep and sleep disturbance and waking behaviors. The researchers involved patients as study subjects to test out this new diary that they created by combining the older instruments. So the question here is about this diary. The diary is a patient-centered outcome measure for A. B, the diary is a patient-reported outcome measure. C, the diary is both patient-centered and patient-reported. Or D, the diary is neither. It's not patient-centered and it's not patient-reported. So vote on this one.
Take about 30 seconds. All right, we'll give you another 10 seconds. And so the answer is B. The diary is a patient-reported outcome measure.
So let's think about this one and let's talk about it a little bit. The researchers that developed the sleep diary, they developed it by combining some older instruments that were existing. But they didn't talk to patients, and they didn't go through the step of confirming that the questions that were in those older instruments actually zeroed in on the things that were important to patients. They chose those older instruments, they combined them together, and they created the diary without the input of patients being involved, and without going back to understand whether or not those older instruments captured what was important to patients. The diary is, however, a patient-reported outcome because the expectation is that the patient will be completing this diary for themselves. They will be answering the questions and reporting the answers themselves, not for someone else to report them or for someone to observe what the patient has been doing. So in this instance, it is a patient-reported outcome measure, but we can't really be sure that it's a patient-centered outcome measure. Now, it could be that these researchers could go back and confirm that these questions that are in these older instruments really do target the things that are important to patients. And if they go back and do that, or if they adapt the questions in some way to capture what's most important to patients, then this tool could be made into a patient-centered tool also, in addition to being patient-reported.
All right.
Great. So again, just a short reminder of the patient's role. We really want to see the patients being active and involved in the development of patient-centered, patient-reported outcome measures, and being involved in the adaptation of some of the old measures if that's what's required. And so again, it's being sure that we're capturing things that are important to patients, that the questions are those that are important to them, that they understand the wording, that they understand the scale, that it makes sense to them, and that the data collection is something that patients are able and willing to do. So at this point, we've got some questions that have come in, but we're open to more of them.
Yep, and so the first question we have is, how can we optimize patient-centered ideologies for a patient registry?
Yeah, great question. I think patient registries, just like any other data capture or data collection effort, could be made more patient-centered by being sure that you have patients who are involved in figuring out the questions to be asked, especially if you're capturing patient-reported information through that registry. You're not just capturing clinical information. So, having the patients be involved in making sure that the questions are those that are important to them, making sure that the information that you're collecting really reflects what patients have told you are the important things that they experience with their disease, and getting at what patients feel and function in their everyday lives, capturing the things that are most important. We want to avoid having a series of questions where, yes, the patients are answering it, and it's patient-reported information, but it's not something that's important to those patients. I think if we can come up with a nice set of questions where we're capturing both things that are important to patients, important to clinicians, then we're going to have a really well-rounded approach to collecting that data.
Thanks, Eleanor. Another question, would you agree that some PROs that were developed prior to the 2009 FDA guidance, even those not developed using similar methodology, can still be patient-centered and measure concepts that are important to patients?
Absolutely. I think we absolutely agree with that it's very, very possible, and that the only thing that we're promoting through this conversation is to say, let's be sure of that. Let's not just accept something because it's easy and it's on the shelf, but let's make sure that we're all in favor of keeping the burden low, keeping the burden low for patients, keeping the burden low for the questionnaire developers or the sponsors of the work to develop those questionnaires. So if there is something useful off the shelf, we're all in favor of that. Let's just confirm that it really does capture what's important to patients before we pull it off the shelf and start using it.
Thanks. Another clarifying question, patient-centered versus PFDD, patient-focused drug development. Is one a subset of the other?
Yes, they're very interrelated. And in all honesty, I haven't thought of them as a subset of one or the other, but I think patient-focused drug development means that patients are engaged in the process and that they're engaged as early as possible. Therefore, as we're approaching any kind of medical product development, we have a good understanding of what's important to patients, what is their experience with their illness, what's their experience with the treatments that they have had in the past or have now, and that we have that good sense of the natural history of the disease from the patient perspective. That way it can ensure that in medical product development, the right outcomes are being selected because they're the ones that patients have told us are important, and that we understand the relationship between the ones that patients say are important versus the ones that we may be collecting in terms of biomarkers and in other ways, that we understand the relationship there. So it's really important to have that patient input early on. And then it's also important to have that patient centricity and patient engagement in what will the studies look like, because then we can construct clinical trials where the protocol is one that patients are willing to sign up for and willing to take part in and willing to stick with. That can help speed the recruitment process and help with retention to help get those trials done sooner, especially if patients don't see the trial process as being too onerous for them. So there's lots of different moving pieces. It just means that patients need to be engaged in the process along the way, and by doing that, you are being patient-centered in that process.
A couple more questions coming in. Directly related to what you were just sort of discussing, interesting thought, will there be a patient-centered seal of approval, or any thoughts or comments you have on that?
I can't see the National Health Council doing a patient-centered seal of approval just since we're so small, we don't have the capacity for something like that. However, I will tell you that one of the things we are actively working on in the next couple of months and have some meetings scheduled for with experts among our members is to pull together a very generic rubric tool of what makes something patient-centered. I think many of you that may be listening are aware that we have a tool for what makes a value assessment patient-centered. We have a rubric for that, and we've had a number of organizations ask us, they see that as a useful tool, and could we make a more generic version of that that would apply to things beyond value assessment, and that's the work that's going on. So we intend to be producing that rubric. We intend to produce that tool so that others could use it for themselves, and it wouldn't necessarily be something that we would apply, but people could apply it for themselves.
All right. One more, well, a couple more actually, but just checking on time, which we're still good on. Best way, and we've done some work in this area, but the best way to get a representative sample of patient voice, specifically for larger diseases.
Yeah, representativeness is always a really key question. We have a document that we've put on our website based on some work that we did last summer on defining what representativeness is. So I would direct people to take a look at that. It's high level, but it starts to give you a picture of what that looks like. And it really means the number and the characteristics of the population that you'd be looking to take part in your patient-centric activity, your patient engagement activity. I think the critical piece that's part of that document is that it really depends on the objective for what you're doing, and that you should think practically about the objective for your work, and whether or not you need one or two people to help you kickstart some thinking about patient engagement, or whether you need a larger sample where you actually would go into some type of sampling calculations to be sure that you're capturing the characteristics of the patient population that you have in mind with regard to the objective of the activity that you're taking on. So I would like to direct you there. Also, in the draft first guidance document that came out from the FDA, there's a sizable component to that addresses representativeness also, and we were really happy to see that it's something that's front of mind for the FDA.
One more question. Is there a repository for validated patient-centered outcomes or patient-reported outcome instruments that you recommend?
I think there's two things I would say about this. Number one is there really isn't a repository of validated patient outcome tools. There is a compendium that the FDA has put out, and I think they are going to be re-releasing it sometime in the near future in its next iteration. I would be cautious about what's in there because I think that there are some limitations that each tool should be investigated. I think the real cautionary note that I would make here is be careful of using the word validated, because validation isn't a stamp that goes on a tool that means it's validated for any purpose, any population, any time, any place. That just does not exist. And so when you think about validation, if you want to think about it in a methodological sense, in the way that the FDA looks at it, the tool has to be validated for the concept that you're trying to capture. So, is that concept which would have to come from patients as being important to them, whether it might be pain or fatigue or whatever that might be, the validation has to be for that concept, but it also has to be in what the FDA refers to as context of use. How do you intend to use that tool? What's the population? What's the circumstance? Is it a clinical trial? Is it in care delivery? Those pieces are very important to understanding whether or not you have a tool that's valid to use under that circumstance. And so it's just cautious to say there isn't such thing as a stamp that goes on a tool that says this tool's good for any time, any place, anywhere, any population. That simply does not exist. And so think about those things when you're looking for the right tool to use.
Is the concept of right to try, I believe that's referring to the right to try legislation that we've seen passed, related to patient-centered?
Oh, that's a really good, very complicated question. I think that getting to the fact that patients, that there are some patient populations that are very desperate for something that helps their population, or many organizations are really looking for the treatment that their population doesn't have, because we have so many diseases and conditions that really don't have a treatment. It is being patient-centered to listen to that patient community about their need, but I think it's also being patient-centered to understand the benefits and the risks that a population is willing to take, and that is also a patient-centered approach. And so I think we do need to think about patient centricity in terms of understanding the need and understanding the trade-offs that a population is willing to make when making those kinds of decisions.
Give you a chance to get a drink of water. Just we had a couple more administrative questions. Will the slides be available? I'm looking at Eleanor, but I believe yes. We'll share them through our PDFs, and we'll send those out in follow-up. We'll just make sure we clean them up appropriately. And yes, there's one question about will you automatically receive an invite to the next webinar if you attended this one? And yes, you will receive that invite for attending this webinar. And next question, one more we have for you, Eleanor, is our organization wants to understand the ROI of patient-centered development. Do you have any way to measure that, or how do you measure that?
Oh my gosh, if I had that, I would be rich. I think that there are lots of ways to examine the ROI. There are many organizations that are thinking about the metrics that they will use. And, as I mentioned earlier, one of the things might be to think about, do you see an impact on recruitment, retention? Those are pretty obvious metrics, and you'd have to use some historical information to be able to make some assumptions about how you might be able to do that. But one of the challenges that I throw out to people when I'm having this conversation is, can you think about a way for you to be able to capture the mistakes that have been avoided because you took a patient-centered approach? And so did you avoid a mistake by choosing a wrong endpoint? And it may not be 100% wrong, but may not have been as accurate as it needed to be. Did you avoid a mistake by by listening to patients and having them help you to change the direction of your target product profile or your protocols that you're writing? Or did you avoid a mistake across the board, across all of your trials, across different therapeutic areas, because you use the opportunity of patient engagement and take something that you learned from a patient engagement experience, and you applied that to the way that you now have an improved process for all of your trials? And what are the errors or the mistakes or the costly downside that you avoided because you did those things? If you could think about those kinds of things also, I think that's also an important way to go, not just what got done better or right and the impact that had, but also what were the mistakes that were avoided that would also have been more costly.
Okay, last question, then we're going to have to move to wrap up. But the cost of developing the right PRO strategy and implementing PROs for disease areas Disease areas can be costly. How should patient advocacy groups and biopharma industry collaborate to drive the right PRO strategy?
Another great question. I think patient advocacy groups are struggling with this because some of them would like to develop tools on their own, and they have learned how expensive this can be. Many companies are developing patient-reported outcome tools for various diseases. I think one of the things to give some serious consideration to is how might this be done in a consortium kind of way when there are multiple companies and multiple patient groups that have the same goal, and therefore it avoids us, number one, having inefficiency and too much burden on the organizations involved. It can be more efficient and less costly. It could also be faster. But it also helps us in that we don't end up with multiple tools for the same disease, and those multiple tools end up competing with one another and us trying to figure out what's the best one.
Thank you. And just one note, if you had asked a question and we weren't able to get to it, we'll make sure we get you a response offline. We're just going to continue moving forward, but again, you'll get a response to that question, and thank you for your participation.
One of the things that we want to ask you as part of this NHD series on clinical outcome assessments is for you to provide to us the topics that you think are really important to you, that you'd want to know more about. And so if you would take the time, if you have something that you think is a burning question or a topic that you'd like to see us cover as part of this series, please take a moment to send us an email message and let us know what those topics might be. We have a list right now of about 20 topics that we think are going to be important to people. We'd like to see whether or not our list overlaps with what people submit. It would help us prioritize what those areas would be and which ones we'll tackle sooner rather than later. So by all means, we want to hear from you. Please send your ideas in and send your questions in. And lastly, we have another webinar that's scheduled for December 7th at 2 o'clock in the afternoon Eastern Time. So please mark your calendar for that. And we want to talk about the FDA Roadmap to Patient-Focused Outcome Measurement in Clinical Trials. We have heard a lot of people talking about the roadmap. It's mentioned in the guidance documents, and we think that it could be a nice framework for people to know about and think about, and at the very least have patients understand or patient groups understand when someone's talking about the roadmap, because it sometimes just gets called the roadmap, that they understand what it is that people are talking about.
Excellent. The aforementioned point that Eleanor had about clinical outcome assessments, we will send out in the follow-up email. I'm just looking through my notes. We'll send out the representativeness document that was mentioned before. We'll send out this quick survey, which gets to the point of what topics you might like to see covered in that webinar series on COA. So I'll make sure everyone gets this. And then we'll also send out PDF versions of slides after we're able to confirm we can get those out. So with that, I'll let you close it out.
Okay. Thank you all for joining. We hope that you will be with us on December 7th, and we hope to hear from you in terms of topics and priorities.
Thank you, everyone.